Happy Video Games Day to everyone. Do what's right and play your favorite video games today. I'll be doing the same.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily podcast on fantasy basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and as always you can find me on Twitter at redrock_bball. We are getting to the end of the season preview series of podcasts, the second last one we're doing today, and that of course is the Brooklyn Nets. And to discuss everything about the Brooklyn Nets, a team with a ton of fantasy intrigue for this season, I am joined by the host of the Locked On Nets podcast, and that is Gavin Schall. Gavin, welcome to the show.
Yeah, really appreciate it, Josh. I think that's kind of fitting that the Nets are a little bit closer to the back end because a team that on the surface isn't that exciting. But as you said, I think there are a couple of intriguing fantasy assets on this squad.
Oh, there's heaps of them. There is a ton of value on this team, and that often happens in fantasy, especially towards the back end of drafts, is that you look at the bad teams and there are going to be options all over the place. We can say the same with Atlanta and Chicago, Indiana, Sacramento, all these Phoenix, all these bad teams. Grabbing those guys at the end of drafts, they have got real opportunities to step up, and that's exactly what we have here with Brooklyn. We start off these shows, Gavin, by looking at the players who have been acquired in the offseason, and Brooklyn's had a pretty interesting offseason, acquiring a number of players, but the one I'm most interested in hearing about is Deangelo Russell, who came across in that trade for Brook Lopez before the NBA draft. I've criticized that trade plenty of times from a Lakers perspective. I love the Nets doing what they did in getting Russell here, but the question still remains, and people have this, burnt-in fear of Russell and of the way Kenny Atkinson used his rotation last season. What do we expect from Russell? Is he moving straight into the starting lineup and playing the 33 minutes a night that he played second half of last season for the Lakers, or will it be a continual minute split the way Atkinson used most of his rotation last year?
You know, it's a pretty fascinating question because you look at Deangelo Russell's raw numbers and they look really, really good from a fantasy perspective, and especially someone at his current age and how those guys normally improve heading into their 2021 season. But Russell just wasn't all that efficient last year, so that's kind of my big question with him, because you got to figure that even if the minutes stay relatively the same, just because of the pace that the Nets play at, he's going to get more opportunities. He's going to put up more shots. He's going to get more assists. In turn, he's probably going to commit more turnovers. As far as your main questions goes, I kind of just hinted at it. I don't think he's really going to break Kenny Atkinson's rule, despite the fact that he's a younger guy and really the future of the Nets franchise. I'd expect him to lead the Nets in minutes or be right behind Jeremy Lin in that category, but I'd expect that to hover around 31, 32 a game. Remember, outside of Lin and Brook Lopez, nobody really consistently played more than 30 minutes a night for the Nets, and I really don't expect that to change for Russell. I think the bigger question as far as his fantasy value goes is how often he's going to be the primary ball handler versus Jeremy Lin, and I'm actually leaning more and more towards Lin in that conversation. I'm sure this is something we'll hit on a couple of times, but Lin was really spectacular last year when he was healthy for the Nets, averaging 21 points, 7.5 assists, 5.5 rebounds per 36 minutes. So I see Lin still being the guy for the Nets, and maybe Russell overtakes him as the season goes on. I expect them both to get a lot of minutes and a lot of shots. So that's kind of a roundabout way of answering your question while also hyping up Jeremy Lin.
I'm going to hype up Jeremy Lin plenty as we get to him a little bit later. But yeah, I agree that he won't be playing in 33 or 34 minutes, but he's not going to need those sort of minutes, Russell, to be a valuable guy. Like if he gets 30 minutes a night, he's still going to be useful. He will play off the ball. I don't have either of Lin or Russell projected to get more than 6 assists per game because there will be some shared ball handling duties. Yes, the field goal percentage for Deangelo is somewhat of a concern, but you can deal with that when you're drafting and when you're setting up your team. But he's going to score, he's going to get some steals, he's going to hit a lot of threes, he's going to get those decent amount of assists, and he's getting picked at pick 71 on ESPN, Deangelo Russell, and that's bananas to me. Like, he has got top 40 upside. He's probably more of a top 50 guy, but you know, if you get him at 71, that's a real steal to me because, again, Atkinson might limit the minutes, but he's not playing 24 minutes a night. Like, he's playing 29, 30, 31, that sort of limit. He probably won't play the 34 that he played second half for the Lakers, where he was this top 35, top 40 player. But in 31 minutes, he can definitely succeed on a team where he is pretty much the default face of the future for this team. Well, that's what they hope he's going to be, and he is the lottery ticket they have as this young player to try and build around. So I'm super into him this season. Hopefully the knee problems that bothered him last year don't rise up again. That's I guess, a minor concern. I'm not caring too much about that, but I really like his value for this year and moving forward as well. One of the other guys they brought across in that trade, or the other guy they did bring across, was Tim Mozgov, who was roundly criticised last year for his play and his contract, but I think the level of criticism was mainly directed at the contract, which is obviously something that he doesn't control. Now, he comes to a Nets team that has no good centres. I think that's probably a fair way of putting it, and there's no massive competition for minutes for him there. The other guys, we've got a rookie Jarrett Allen, who we didn't even see in Summer League due to injury, and recently signed Tyler Zeller. So we would have to assume, Gavin, that Tim Mozgov comes in as the starter, but are we going to be seeing 20-minute Laker Tim Mozgov, or 25-minute Cavalier Tim Mozgov, or is it a throwback to the Denver Nugget Tim Mozgov that we saw?
Yeah, I would have been all in on him. In fact, I drafted super early in one of my leagues, and I snagged him with my final pick. Yep. At the urging of my absentee co-host, Josh Bass. And I was pretty confident he was going to play a ton, but now that they're bringing in Tyler Zeller, not that Zeller is any great shakes, and I don't think he's a particularly talented basketball player, but that at least represents another body that's NBA ready, which they frankly really didn't have, because Jarrett Allen is a guy who's raw to the point that I think at least in the first half of the year, he's really not going to play a lot. So I initially had Mozgov amongst the leaders on the team just in terms of minutes per game. With Zeller in there, that makes me a little bit more cautious, but I still see him playing in the mid to high 20s, and I think he's a pretty good option at the back end of a fantasy draft. And at least in my group of friends, I think that's always the type of asset that guys underrate and you inevitably don't draft, but try and pick up during the season. The guy who scores about 10 points a game, hovers around 6, 7, 8 rebounds maybe, and is an efficient scorer while also collecting blocks on the other end. If you build your fantasy squad around a James Harden type superstar, if you're lucky enough to get someone like that, that's exactly the type of guy I look at to fill out the back end of my rosters. So I think Mozgov is kind of the perfect archetype of that. Even though he's not a great player, I say this a lot, it's more about opportunity than talent a lot of the time, and I think Mozgov is the perfect example of that.
Yeah, I haven't been super aggressive with his minutes. I've got him projected at 25 minutes a game, but there's just no one else there unless they're going to go small and play Trevor Booker at center a little bit more. You said about Allen, I think that, I thought that he was going to have to be forced into a bigger role now, but with Tyler Zeller around, he will, I think, have his minutes limited and his appearances limited, so I do agree with you there. Some people are thinking that Zeller comes in as the third string. I think that he immediately moves into that backup role, as you touched on there as well. Mozgov, you said efficient, like he's going to give you a good field goal percentage, but he's also a good free throw shooter, so that's handy. He keeps threatening that he's going to shoot threes, and we know that Brook Lopez was taking...
Yeah, I don't know if I buy that.
I buy that he will take some. I don't buy that he will take 300 plus that Brook Lopez did, but I buy that he will take some. I've got him projected at less than half a three made per game, which I think maybe he hits one every 4 or 5 games. Maybe he can do that. That's sort of where I'm at with him. But I've got him at 25 minutes, but I think that he could play 27 minutes a game, and he could be a 10 and 8 sort of player, as you mentioned, with 1.2 blocks and good efficiency, which puts him really rock solid in that top 120 type of range. We talk about the dearth of centers that are available, and while he's not going to be a high 30-minute a game guy, the guys around him, there's just no one who's really pushing to challenge for anything. Because I agree with you, Tyler Zeller is nothing. Like, he's not a good player, and Mozgov is a significantly better player. And he's got a couple of 2020 games in his resume. Yes, they were back in Denver a few years ago, but he is a guy that can put up these big numbers. And as you mentioned, I wouldn't be surprised if in the first 2 weeks of the season people are rushing to the wire to grab Mozgov, because he puts up these surprising performances that people go, oh, well, maybe he's not completely horrible, which he's not, clearly.
He had 28 points in a finals game 2 years ago, and I know last season he seemed kind of like a diminished version of that guy, and there was a reason the Lakers immediately regretted that contract. But I mean, you said it. I mean, this guy very much wasn't a joke. And anyone who's been relevant on that high of a level, going to a team that doesn't have a guy at that position, is someone I'm interested in.
Yeah, you definitely should be looking at Mozgov, and don't be turned off by what happened last season with him. The other guy, or one of the other guys they traded for this offseason, was Alan Crabb, after they signed him to that offer sheet the season before. They got off the Andrew Nicholson deal. I'm not going to go ahead and go through the mechanics of the trade and any criticisms of it, but he arrives now. What we want to know is where he sort of fits into this team. He is likely to be the starter, I would say, at small forward. Would you agree with that, Gavin?
Yeah, I don't know. That's been a big point of contention on our podcast and something we've gone back and forth on quite a few times. Because I think Karis LeVert still has a legitimate claim to that starting job as kind of outside of D'Lo now, maybe the Nets' most promising young asset. But right now, I agree with you. I'm leaning towards Crabbe starting. Because this is a team that Kenny Atkinson wants to predicate this offense around spacing the floor and taking a lot of threes and hitting them at a relatively high volume. And Crabbe's kind of the perfect candidate for that. He was the third most efficient three-point bomber in basketball last year, hitting 47% of his shots. You take out Pau Gasol, who only took about 104, then he's only behind Kyle Korver. So he's a guy that I think they were willing to pay $75 million last offseason and were willing to take on that contract this offseason without getting a first-round pick back, because they're projecting that at a higher volume of threes, he can still hit over 40%. And based on just how good of a shooter he was last year and small flashes of a one or two dribble pull-up game, I think they're probably correct in that assessment. Sean Marks hasn't really had a big miss yet. I don't really expect Allen Crabbe to be that guy. I think he's going to hit a lot of threes next season at a pretty good volume and be a fantasy steal for that reason.
I agree with you that he's going to shoot a lot of threes. The problem I have with him is he does so little in other areas. Like he's not a good assist guy. He doesn't get high steals or blocks. He doesn't get to the line at all. He doesn't rebound the ball. But he should be a guy that improves from what we saw from him in Portland last season. So I feel okay about grabbing him late. He's getting picked at 144 on Yahoo. He doesn't have an ADP at all on ESPN. So picking him late is totally fine because he could come out, surprise us, and average 15 points and get 4 rebounds and hit 3 triples a game and have 1.5 steals. And they're all above the projections that I've got him at, but they're not crazy numbers to expect. And that would put him in that top 100 consideration. So we know he's going to get the minutes. We know he's going to get the shot attempts. And maybe in a bigger role, he can start to flourish. But interesting you said about LeVert. I think that LeVert could potentially, I think LeVert might already be close to being as good a player as what Crabbe is, and I think his potential is higher than him for his ability to do multitudes of different things on the court, and I wish they would have given that extra opportunity to LeVert there, but that doesn't look like it's going to happen. But as for Crabbe, a really nice late pick there. The other guy they brought across is Damari Carroll, who I've been quite critical of with his form over the past 2 seasons. The knee problems have been a concern. He's been pretty poor when he's been on the court anyway. So where does he fit in? Backup 3, backup 4? Do you think he plays at backup 4 ahead of, say, a Trevor Booker?
I actually, this might come as a shock to some people, but I have him starting at the 4 for the beginning of next season. And I know Rondae Hollis-Jefferson is a guy a lot of people are penciling in at that spot, or as you mentioned, Trevor Booker. But I don't know. I think he's just kind of a clean fit in the sense that he provides that floor spacing while still having the physicality, admittedly not to the same degree that he did earlier in his career before the knee injuries, but while having that physicality to hold up to other opposing fours. And then you kind of accomplish that floor spacing and kind of limit, I guess, his ability to get destroyed on the other end guarding perimeter guys, and you just let him bang with 4s a little bit. So I think that's kind of the cleanest fit for him in the lineup, and just because he does have seniority over Hollis-Jefferson, and Hollis-Jefferson is really the antithesis of what the Nets want on the offensive end. I could see him being a part of starting lineups, and maybe they start Hollis-Jefferson some nights when you're going up against maybe the most dynamic perimeter guys in the league and you need that shutdown defender. But I really think that's his fit. And I think if he's not starting at that 4 spot, as you described, he probably plays a lot of backup minutes there. I could see him falling out of the rotation as the season goes on. I know he's someone I've tried to get in drafts the last couple of years, and I leave disappointed year after year after year, and it seems like he's never going to be that guy he was on the Hawks again. But I think on this Nets team, in this system, getting the ball a little bit more, being allowed to be a little bit more comfortable than he was with 2 ball stoppers in Toronto, I think he could be relatively effective and kind of like Crabbe. He's a guy that I'd either target at the end of my draft, or if you want to be more cautious, maybe a wait and see approach. And if he busts out the first week of the season, he's someone I would take a swing at on waivers.
Yeah, I would take Crab ahead of him with a late pick. I would leave Carroll on the wire to see what goes on. I'm not really having any confidence he can return to the level of play he was in Atlanta. But the point that you make about the different type of offense is key. That was the concern I always had when he went to Toronto, is that playing under that different system would really impact him, and it clearly did. The knee injuries compounded that. So moving to a different style of offense in Brooklyn could help him, but I just feel like his body is just not going to recover to the level that it needs to. But he's definitely a name that we need to watch in that situation. We talked about Zala already, and he's not really going to impact too many people. He's going to be an extraordinarily deep league sort of guy. The other two guys they signed on two-way deals, Jacob Wiley and Yakuba Ouattara, the Frenchman, on a two-way deal. We're not going to see a huge amount of those guys. The departures, Brook Lopez went to the Lakers, Justin Hamilton went to the Raptors and then was waived. Archie Goodwin's gone, Randy Foy's gone, Luis Scola has gone, KJ McDaniels has signed with the Raptors, and Andrew Nicholson went to the Blazers, and then he was subsequently stretched and waived. If we look to the draft, though, now, Gavin, Jarrett Allen was that first-round pick. I thought he was going to play a significant role, and I didn't hate using him as a last pick in the draft just in case Mozgov faltered, or if they were just going to have to give him 21 minutes out of the gate straight away. But as we've touched on already, he's probably going to be pretty significantly limited, at least to start the season, isn't he?
Yeah, 100%. He's a guy I really like down the road, and in a lot of ways was kind of presents an archetype that was missing on the Nets roster. 7'6" wingspan. He's an explosive finisher, and I think once he kind of hits his stride, he's going to be that pick and roll threat down the middle. And everyone always talks about horizontal spacing, and he kind of provides that vertical spacing that. And if you want to think of an example of how that could be really, really effective surrounded by shooters, you don't need to look any further than JaVale McGee with the Warriors. He was putting up a 36 PER in the playoffs and finals last season. That guy can be ridiculously efficient in the right offense. And I think if Allen hits his upside, he's a better version of JaVale McGee. But as of now, as you said, extremely raw in a lot of ways, though he had games where he was totally dominant. He was too raw to be consistently effective on the college level. So I kind of expect a little bit of a redshirt year for him. If the Nets were just a slightly better team, I'd argue he'd spend most of the season in the D-League. I think he'll start getting some big minutes by the end of the season when the Nets are in full I don't really care mode anymore. But I don't really see him being fantasy relevant at all this season.
Yeah, look, with these recent changes with Zeller, I agree with that. He's a guy that's a decent shot blocker. He's a good rebounder. He's a poor free throw shooter, but a high efficiency field goal guy. So he does have some value in dynasty leagues, especially when we look at this Nets team and go, well, Mozgov's not the future of this team at center, and no one else on this roster is. So he's got the opportunity to potentially be that. It probably, for him to become an upper level center, there's a lot of work to be done, but the opportunity is going to be there for him over the next couple of seasons to try and prove that. So there is a little bit of upside there. The other guy they took in the second round of the draft, Alexander Vezenkov, who is remaining over in Europe to play for Barcelona. He's like a 6'9" forward who's a really good three-point shooter. How much do you know about Vezenkov?
Not a whole lot, just because, as you said, he's not coming over this year. He was an extremely efficient player over in Europe, though. He shot 69.4% on two-point attempts in his league play. And a lot of people have compared him to, I'll preemptively apologize for my pronunciation here, but Mindaugas Kuzminskis of New York Knicks fame. So someone maybe a couple years down the line who could be interesting. Obviously not a name you need to know this season. I'll throw one more note on the Allen front at you, and this is something we kind of talked about with Mozgov. I think rebounding and efficient scoring are things that always get underrated in fantasy, and Allen's a guy who I think really brings that down the road. He had an 8-game run in college where he averaged 20 points on 64% shooting, and even more impressive, he averaged an offensive rebound a minute when he was in, so that's something to potentially look out for down the road with him.
Yeah, look, he is interesting. I like Vezenkov as well. That Kuzminskis comparison is interesting. He's a really good three-point shooter who can be helpful, but we're a long way down the track. But again, on this Nets team, we're talking about very few star potential guys who are on this team who have got positions locked down. So if he comes across and shows out, maybe he can work his way into a Mirza Teletovic type of role as a backup 3-4 type of three-point shooter who plays 20 minutes a game and is useful for deeper fantasy leagues. Now, I get this question a lot, and it's ridiculous to me, but I still get the question. People say, I'm worried about drafting Jeremy Lin. I'm worried about his injuries. And I just say, that's cool, but the 3 previous seasons he played 78, 74, and 71 games, and he had one injury last year that lingered. It was a hamstring problem. They pushed him back a little bit too early from it. He hurt it 3 times. We shouldn't have any concerns about his hamstring heading into next season, should we?
No, I mean that's obviously an injury that's on some guys that's something that can linger throughout a whole career, but just because Lynn never flashed that problem, or as far as I know, until this season,
No,
I'm not too concerned about it. And as I mentioned at the top, he was a guy who put up big counting stats when he played and did it relatively efficiently, shooting 44% from the field, 87% from the free throw line, and really improving as a perimeter shooter. And I think to me this is the biggest development in his game, 37% from 3. And with the way the Nets like to play, and even though Brook Lopez was more of a 3-point shooter last year, he'd still occasionally clog up the floor. If and when the Nets do go small and throw someone like Booker at center, or maybe even throw out lineups with 5 nominal smalls, I think Lynn could really go off on the offensive end, because what he's always been best at, and what kind of started the whole insanity trend, is his ridiculous ability to get to the basket, and his combination of explosiveness and hand-eye coordination that very, very few guards across the league possess. I think he's going to have a great season, and kind of I know everyone looks back at the Linsanity stretch, but that was 10, 12 games. This is his breakout season in my mind. I think he's going to be an absolute monster this year. My only concern would be him being excellent in the first half, and then Sean Marks trading him for assets and him ending up on a team where his usage just isn't quite as high. But outside of that, I think he's going to be spectacular this year, and I think he's way underdrafted.
He's getting picked at pick 96, which is one of the stupidest draft positions that there is in the entire fantasy basketball realm. It's bananas. He's a top 60 player without any doubt in my mind. He's probably a top 50, top 40 upside guy. Like last season he played 24 and a half minutes a game, and he was the 62nd ranked player. So people drafting on ESPN are assuming he's playing 18 minutes a game if they think he's the 96th ranked player based on that. Like, he was sensational. People go, oh yeah, Atkinson's going to limit his minutes. Like, that's bullshit. Atkinson didn't limit his minutes last season. He limited his minutes as he returned from injury. And there was always this misinformation. People like, oh, when Lynn's not going to come back, they're going to shut him down and they're going to play him only 20 minutes a night. He didn't. He came back from his hamstring and he played 30 minutes a night down the stretch there. Like, there were games where they reduced it occasionally because we're talking April games, but he was fantastic down that stretch, and I see no reason why he's going to be 35 spots worse than what he was last season in a season he played only 24 minutes. So if there's a guy that is just criminally underrated and underdrafted in fantasy drafts, it's Lynn, and it's just crazy to me. And if you get him at pick 80, you've already snagged 30 spots worth of value with him with significant upside, and I've only got him projected at 29 minutes a game. If he plays 30, 31, then we're talking a top 40 player. He is going to put together big numbers, and it is one of the steals of the draft, and he should be in every draft queue that you set up, and you should be looking to get him late. And even if you get him at pick 75, you're still getting value on that, even though it's 20 spots above his ADP. I cannot stress enough how much value you can get with drafting Jeremy Lin this year. And I don't care about Russell. They play together. That they will play together. I can guarantee you the minutes will be there, and he's going to put up those numbers. And I know that you obviously agree with me on that. The other injury, Alan Crabb. Have you heard how his foot is? Because he did have a broken foot. He's okay to go?
Yeah, I haven't heard anything on him recently. As far as I know, he should be fine to start training camp. I think he's just about all healed up. But I frankly haven't really heard all that much on it, so maybe I'm off there, but it seems like he's okay.
No, there hasn't been any real information. It's one of those things, like the guy broke his foot, had a foot fracture, and we just didn't hear anything about it, but it appears like it was minor and he is fine, but it's just been weirdly underreported, that the fact that he did have that issue. We've talked about Lynn, we've talked about Russell, we've talked about the blue swimmer, Alan Crabb. What about Karis LeVert? I want to talk about how good I think this guy can be. Now, I think he's going to be a little bit muted this season, but I don't hate taking him as a last pick. Because if he pushes ahead of 25 minutes and maybe takes some minutes off Crabb and plays 29 a night, which is a stretch given how they managed him last season with his broken foot problems, but he gets assists, he hits threes, he gets steals, he can be efficient from the field, he can score, He is a top 60-ish type upside guy in the next 3 seasons, I believe, and you should be looking at him as a dynasty type player. But for this year, there are going to be some limitations on him, aren't there?
Yeah, I absolutely love Karis LeVert. If you're not necessarily in terms of style of play, but if you're looking at a fantasy mold to compare him to down the road, I see him as a Chris Middleton with more assist potential. He's just so versatile, and he comes in, and frankly, the only reason the Nets were able to get him where they did was because of all the injury issues he dealt with throughout college. I'm still kind of surprised they ended up with him because he plays and he performs like a lottery talent. And in Summerlee, getting to watch him as in kind of an alpha dog role, I mean, I know a million NBA pundits have made the sin of overrating Summerlee and looking too far into that, but he just looks like a guy who could be a number 1, number 2, number 3 scorer down the road. And I can't say enough about how much I like his game. I think his combination of length and shooting ability is really going to turn him into a star.
He can do so many different things. Like in Summer League, he averaged 16 points in 26 minutes, 5 boards, 2 assists, and did that with only shooting 17% from 3, even though he did shoot 48% overall from the field. So really efficient. I love his upside. There is, if you took him with a late pick this year, I wouldn't have a problem with it, but it seems unlikely that he's going to be able to push to the level that he needs to. Like next year, if Jeremy Lin declines his player option and goes somewhere else, or if they trade him, that opens up another spot in that backcourt, and you could see a Russell, LeVert, Crabbe 1, 2, 3 setting, and all 3 of those guys playing 30 to 32 minutes a night. And with LeVert and Russell, both of them being a top 50 threat. So he is a name to watch. He's an upside waiver wire-ish type guy at the moment. There was a ton of hype about him last year. He was up and down mainly with the minutes. And the minutes are going to be the concern again. But I think we just look ahead to the future with him and see how that all works. Now, one guy who was impressive, especially early last season, Gavin, in that backcourt, is Shaun T Kilpatrick. Now, I think that he is going to be severely limited this year because we're talking about bringing 2 guys in that position in Russell and Crabbe, and I just can't see how Kilpatrick is going to be able to replicate the level of play or the amount of minutes that he had last season where he played 25 minutes a game. I see no realistic path for him doing that.
Yeah, that guard rotation is just too busy, and we kind of talked about Allen Crabbe being a one-note player. I really see Kilpatrick the same way. He's not the most efficient 3-point shooter in the world. He did average 4 rebounds a game last season, so that was kind of the one little bit of upside for him. And I know the only time I really looked at him on waiver wires is if I was playing in a roto league and I was down by points and I needed a Hail Mary on the last day. But I don't even really see him being that type of asset this year just because he was a guy who thrived off of volume more than anything else. And as you so astutely pointed out, with the new guys coming in and with Karis likely making at least a little bit of a jump, I don't think that volume is going to be there unless there are a couple of injuries in front of him. I don't really see him as a guy who's fantasy relevant this season.
He's getting picked at 147 on Yahoo, and LeVert's going at 146, which is crazy to me. Kilpatrick will struggle to crack the top 250 this year. He just is not going to get anywhere near that playing time that he got last season. Speaking of players who won't get the playing time that they got last season, Joe Harris played an extraordinary 1,138 minutes last year, which is that's craziness. 22 minutes a night for Joe Harris. Over under this season, 100 minutes for Joe Harris.
Over under 100.
Yep.
I'll go slightly over just because if Allen Crabbe gets hurt, he kind of fills that role. But I like you. I don't really see him as someone who's interesting in fantasy at all. I think they re-signed him under the premise that they didn't get someone like Allen Crabbe, or the Damari Carroll trade didn't happen. He was kind of the last case scenario. Let's run everything back. He's going to play a little bit. He's a nice shooter, and I know last year was kind of a big thing around the Nets organization that they treated him like Kyle Korver and they'd run him around 4 or 5 screens just because, frankly, outside of his shooting ability and having some nice size, he can't really do anything else. And Crabbe is just a dramatically better version of the same guy. So I don't really see a spot for him.
Yep. No, I go the under and 100 minutes for Joe Harris this season. He is I've got him projected at 99 minutes for the season. So that's why I asked that question.
No, I love it. Yeah, we'll bet a beer on it if I'm ever in.
Trevor Booker, another guy who played a lot of minutes last season, played 25 minutes a game, but over the last month of the season saw his role dramatically reduced as he moved to the bench and Rondé Hollis-Jefferson started ahead of him. I think we see a similar Trevor Booker to what we saw in the second half of last season, but some people think they're going to be getting back to 25 minute per game Trevor Booker, who was stealing balls at a extraordinary rate. Something was just completely out of character with anything he'd done in his career. That faded. So where do we see Booker now? Is he going to be a 25 minute a game guy? Is he going to be pushed down to this below 20 minute guy who just fills in a little bit at the 4 and the 5?
Yeah, he's a mystery for me because I really see it going one of two ways, and it all depends just on how much Kenny Atkinson likes the idea of a small ball lineup with either Carroll or Hollis-Jefferson at the 4. If that ends up being his primary, and I kind of have a feeling it is just because that kind of fits thematically with what he wants to get done offensively, then there's a very good chance that Booker's gets pushed down at least a little bit and is hovering more around 20 minutes a game. But I also think there's a pretty distinct possibility he's up there, and just because they don't really have outside of Mozgov and now Tyler Zeller, and frankly I think Booker's a better player and it's not all that close than Tyler Zeller. They just don't have a lot of big, so I would bet more likely than not he has a pretty solid role, and he's hovering around 23 to 26 minutes a night. And I know that sounds like I'm contradicting myself with them going small ball a lot, but I see him playing some center just because even though he's only 6'8", he's kind of a big bodied guy, and I don't think he's holding up against the behemoths of the league, but against a lot of teams that are also going in a similar direction with small ball, I think he'll be pretty solid. And just like Mozgov, a guy who averaged 10 points, 8 rebounds, shot better than 50% from the field, that guy is valuable in fantasy year in and year out. Again, not necessarily a guy at draft, just because I think there's a lot of players like him that you can get on waivers pretty much at any point in the season. But he's someone who, if I see after 2 or 3 games into the year he's playing 26 minutes a game, I'm going to look to pick him up if I have that spot on my roster.
He had his crazy run with steals, as I mentioned last year, which really inflated his value. Like, he started the season in the first 5 games. In 3 of those games, he had 3 steals. In the first 8 games of the season, in the first 8 games of the season, 5 of those games he had 3 steals. He had a run at the end of November where he had 4 steals, 3 steals, 1, 4, and 2 in 5 games. Like, these numbers were crazy. In the end, he only ended up averaging 1 steal per game as it dropped off and went back to career numbers. But people have that in their head. Oh my God, Trevor Booker was this awesome waiver wire pickup. He's going to continue to do that. It just never seemed 100% sustainable. And for some reason, he's getting drafted at 118 in ESPN leagues, which there's just no reason for that. You don't need to be drafting him at that position. But look, he could find himself in a larger role, but he's far from a high priority sort of a player, in my opinion. Now, we've talked a little bit about Hollis-Jefferson. We've talked around him a little bit. He was quite disappointing last season, but I thought he showed some strides at the end. Why was Atkinson limiting him as much as he was?
Just because he can't shoot, frankly, and that's such an essential part of the net system, and that's what they want to do. They want to have spacing at every single spot. There's a reason they devoted a whole offseason into teaching Brook Lopez how to shoot. And Hollis-Jefferson, I was, if anything, a little bit discouraged watching him in Summerlee, just because he'd have flashes of brilliance and flashes of athletic ability that you frankly don't typically see in that level, with the exception of rookies who went in the most recent lottery. But he doesn't have that ability to shoot. He still looks out of sorts dribbling the ball for more than 5 seconds at a time. So I just don't think he has that total game yet. And he's far and away the Nets' best perimeter defender, best overall defender. So he's kind of a walking paradox in that sense, that he does this thing that's so essential to the Nets, but then he's absolute poison on the other end. So that conundrum hasn't really cleared itself up, unless he made some big leap from Summer League to the start of the season that I don't really foresee happening. So I really don't see him as a reliable fantasy guy. What I do see him as is that Saturday or Sunday pickup, assuming you're like me. I don't really know if there's another style league. You play in a league with weekly scoring. If I need a boost in steals or blocks on the last day, he's kind of the guy I'm looking for on waivers more than almost anyone else in the league. that would be available in that spot. So I think he has some value there, but he's almost like the equivalent of a deep relief pitcher in baseball that only comes out at super specific times. I don't really see him having an all-inclusive role.
He is a guy that's a poor shooter, but it doesn't necessarily translate to his field goal percentage. Like, he can be a decent field goal, not a great one, but a decent field goal percentage guy, which sort of belies how poor of a shooter he is. Like, he was 43% last year, which is not great, but it's on low volume, so it's not really a big impact in fantasy. But where his value lies is he is a really strong rebounder of his position, good steals, and really good blocks for that position as well. So he's getting picked at 144 on Yahoo. I would happily take him in the last round of drafts or the second last round for those rebounds, steals, and block numbers. He's a slightly below average free throw guy. The field goals are sort of middle of the pack as well. But there is that risk, and the upside is limited by his offensive limitations and the fact that will then limit his playing time. But to produce those stats, I've got no problem with drafting him in leagues just to get those defensive numbers. But it is really situation specific and team specific as well. And another couple of guys, Gavin, last year who put in significant playing time and showed themselves out to be okay players and had people in fantasy debating the merits of using them were Spencer Dinwiddie and Isaiah Whitehead. With the addition of Deangelo Russell with a healthy Jeremy Lin, both of these guys figure to not really be in the rotation every night anymore. What I'm asking you to do is tell me who you think is better out of those two guys.
I think it's pretty clearly Spencer Dinwiddie at this point. Isaiah Whitehead's really fun because he's a local guy. He plays with a lot of heart. He's really good defensively. To me, he's a slightly poor man's Marcus Smart in a lot of ways. So I think he's a guy who, if he's on your team, you absolutely love him. And anyone who's kind of that scrappy, aggressive type of player, which I bet are a bunch of your podcast listeners, they're really into him. But Dinwiddie is just significantly. I don't know any other way to say it. He's just better overall. He plays with much better pace. He's a lot more heady. He knows when and where things are going to happen. Just getting a chance to watch him a ton in summer league, he's really an expert at manipulating defenses, and that really allows him to overcome what at the NBA level is subpar athleticism for a guard. He's someone who I absolutely love, and if he was a couple years younger, I would say would be on a trajectory to be a really, really good NBA player. As it is, I still think he's pretty effective in that Nets backcourt rotation, and especially if one of Russell or Lin goes down, I think he's someone you should certainly have on your team.
He was a top 200 player last year in 22 minutes per game. He had a nice little stretch at the end of the year. He had 13, 2 and 7, 11, 3 and 3, and 19, 3 and 4 in 3 consecutive games to end the season. But as the third string point guard now, his value is limited, and he probably doesn't even have top 80 or top 90 upside in a 30-minute per game role. But he is an interesting player, and I agree. He's significantly better than Whitehead, even though there were times when Whitehead would start over him almost invariably. Dinwiddie would play more minutes coming off the bench, and he is the more fantasy-friendly guy. But we're talking about really deep leagues here, and his upside is significantly limited on this team. I think there's only one guy left we really need to touch on, and we don't really even need to touch on him too much, and that's Quincy Acey, who I think will struggle to see the court now. I thought he'd play a little bit of small ball center before the Tyler Zeller signing, but now he's going to probably be a third-string power forward and a third or fourth-string center a lot of the time.
Yeah, I don't really see him having much of a role on this team. Zeller, I guess, is a guy we didn't really spend a ton of time on. We've kind of mentioned him in reference to other players. The only shot I would take on him is that when he did get, he never really got big minutes in his career, but in 2013-14 and 14-15, he was playing 15 minutes and 21 minutes respectively. And if you really want to focus in specifically on the 2014-15 season where he was starting a bunch of games for Boston, he did shoot 55% from the field. And I think we both agree that we like Mozgov more than him, but Mozgov isn't such a good player and is also injury prone enough that I wouldn't say it's a total lock. He's starting there for the majority of the season. So you throw Zeller in there. He's playing big minutes, playing around a lot of shooters. So he's a lot of space and time to operate in the paint. He's never going to win you your league or win you your week one way or another. But he's another guy in that mold that can be super efficient in the right spot, even if I don't think he's a particularly exceptional basketball player overall.
In that 14-15 season, he was the 152nd ranked fantasy player in only 21 minutes a night. One weird thing about Tyler Zeller last year, his two previous seasons, he shot 82% from the line and 82% from the line. Last year, 56%. That is an incomprehensible drop in free throw percentage. To drop 25% from the line is ludicrous. I don't know how that can happen, and that's over a span of 51 games as well. So it's not like it's a 10-game sample or anything. The fact that he could just be like, it wasn't many attempts. He did have
he only took
39 attempts, but it's still a massive drop off. 39 attempts and hit 22 of them, whereas the year before he was at 88 from 108. So it is a significant change. I think that he can get that free throw percentage back up to a level that had been consistent throughout his career. But it is a weird thing when you look at his numbers from last year, just to see how low it did drop. Who would you classify as your breakout candidate on this team, Gavin? You can phrase that in whatever way you want.
Yeah, I think I can't talk about him enough. I absolutely think it's Jeremy Lin. I'm of the opinion he's going to truly be a star this year. We said it at the top of the show, but I think it bears repeating one more time. Hovering around 21 points and just under 8 assists and 6 rebounds a game per 36 minutes last year. And I'd encourage anyone who's hesitant about drafting him, just going on YouTube, getting on that Dawkins page. I'm sure everyone has queued up already, and checking out some of his better efforts from last year. Because there were times, especially in the Eastern Conference, that's pretty bereft of top-level guard talent, that he would just make guys look stupid, hitting the three ball better than ever. And for people who have concerns about Deangelo Russell coming in, I'll throw this out there. He's not going to take away more possessions than Brook Lopez was, because Brook Lopez in a lot of ways was the fulcrum of this team, even when both him and Lin were healthy. And I think that gravitational pull shifts in Lin's favor. Another thing to his advantage is, outside of him and Russell, there really isn't another creator on this team, or at least one that'll be on the court at the same time. You don't have that really great passing / attacking forward. Pretty much everyone else is a shooter. So in a lot of ways, if you're talking purely about a point guard putting up good stats, potentially at the expense of winning, I think this team sets up perfectly for either Lin or Russell to have a good season. If I'm taking one of those two guys, it is absolutely Lin, just because of his increased experience and how good he was last year in Atkinson's system.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fantastic. I said that already. He's one of the best value players in the entire NBA at pick 96. It's ridiculous. You need to get him. Russell is great value as well. I don't mind Rondé Hollis-Jefferson at 104, Crabbe, Levert, Mozgov, all these guys as late picks. There's a ton of value on this team. That's what I talk about. Looking at these teams that aren't playoff contenders, there is a lot of value, and you've got a ton of guys that you can grab here. The only guy that I wouldn't recommend grabbing at their ADP is Trevor Booker at 118. I just don't understand that one, but there is just value all over the place with so many of these Brooklyn guys. One last thing, Gavin, before I get you out of here. The Vegas line for the wins is 28.5, which to me seems a little high, but do you go the over or under with that?
I'm actually now I feel bad about it that you said that, but I'm and this might be a homer pick, but I'm going to take the over. We had Ryan Ruocco, the Nets and ESPN's national NBA broadcaster, on last week, and he took the over, and I think he made a really good point about how well the Nets played after the All-Star break. They were 11-13, and you can look at that and say, well, there's no more Brook Lopez, and that's absolutely fair. But at the same time, I think the big difference there was that Lin was healthier and generally playing more, running the show. I think they're going to be a team that just has some nights where they bury opposing teams in three balls, and kind of like the Rockets, like even when the other assets of their game aren't really working, which will be more often because they don't have that level of talent, they can win purely off that. My only concern there, and this is what I mentioned in regard to Lin's fantasy value earlier in the podcast, is if they're doing well, and if Lin in particular is doing well, or someone like Damari Carroll is having an exceptional season, and a contender looks to acquire one of those two guys, that could be how they fall off and fall back a little bit. But as has been the case for what feels like the last 30 seasons now, the Nets have no motivation to be bad. So I think they, just by the skin of their tail, cross that 28-win threshold.
It's going to be a significant improvement on last season if they get there. That's why I'm a little bit cautious of it, but agreed. That record for them in March was spectacular when Lin returned, and the Lopez loss is something that's important, but the addition of Crabbe, Carroll, and Russell can probably offset that. So it is going to be interesting to see how it all pans out. If they won 30 games, I definitely wouldn't be shocked. I just don't necessarily think they're going to get there, but they do have the ability to be better this season. Gavin, thanks for coming on. And before you go, why don't you tell everyone what you've got coming up on Locked On Nets and anything else that you want to promote and plug?
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Josh. Well, I'd encourage people to look back, because I think we're coming off perhaps our best episode so far, having Ryan Ruocco on the podcast, and he kind of tells his story of how he got into play-by-play broadcasting at an incredibly young age, is broadcasting games for the New York Yankees before the age of 30, which is arguably the best job in all of broadcasting. So it's a pretty incredible story, and he also kind of gets into the Nets and has a pretty incredible story on how Brook Lopez did not, despite everyone's expectations, want to see the new Star Wars movie and had to be talked into it by the Rockets' Ryan Anderson. So that's pretty interesting. I check it out for that. As far as upcoming podcasts, we are going to be doing a lot of season preview stuff. We do mailbags every month, so anyone who wants to get in on that can just check out the Nets Reddit. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it is at Gavin Schall. It's mostly NBA stuff, but I also work for the NFL in my side time, so it's a little bit of that, a little bit of college football. A lot of fun all around. I'd encourage everyone to check all that out. And Josh, I'd like to thank you for having me on. It was truly a blast.
No problem, Gavin. Make sure you do check out Locked On Nets and Gavin on Twitter, and subscribe to both of our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, TuneIn, and Stitcher, and on Spotify now as well. Leave a review. 5 stars would be awesome. So if you can do that for both of our shows, we would be very much appreciative, Gavin. Thank you again for coming on and speaking about the Nets with me.
Absolutely.
We are done here, guys. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya. Jarrett